Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're really glad to have you here at our webinar today on how cities can defend human rights in the face of mass deportations. I'm Ev Mead. I'm director of a small NGO called Proceso Pacifico. I'm based in San Diego, and I've been working on human rights and border issues for the last 25 years or so. But I'm here today as a member of the steering committee of the Human Rights Cities Alliance. For those of you who don't know us, welcome. The Human Rights Cities Alliance is a network of activists, advocates, and scholars that promotes human rights organizing in cities and communities throughout North America. We support local coalitions committed to using and implementing global human rights principles and practices as they've been interpreted and adapted by social movements around the world. The idea is to create more equitable and just communities by using human rights as a tool. The HRCA connects and supports these local efforts and builds ties between local and global networks, movements, and institutions. So why this webinar today on immigration? Well, because the targeting of non-citizens for arrest, detention, and deportation with as little due process and as much spectacle as possible seems to be the #1 priority of the President of the United States and his closest allies. I would argue that this is the most immediate threat to human rights facing our cities right here, right now. That's why we're here. And we've recruited 2 experienced and supremely qualified immigration lawyers to help us today. And they'll pay special attention to what those of us who are not lawyers or who don't have much experience with immigration policy can do to help defend the human rights of non-citizens in our own communities. I know it's scary times, and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. The specter of detention camps, family separation, the militarization of the border, and the summary denial of persecution and torture claims is real, and it's terrifying. But there are proven measures that we can take to blunt, challenge, and possibly overturn such policies. And whatever happens, cities will play a critical role in this effort. The first step is to get organized and informed, and that's the goal of this webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Mary Meg McCarthy is an immigration lawyer and executive director of the National Immigrant Justice Center in Chicago, which she's helped build into the largest pro bono immigration legal service provider in the United States. They have a network of more than 1,500 volunteer attorneys who, along with NIJC staff, represent more than 10,000 individual clients per year in jurisdictions across the United States, and in venues that range from remote detention centers to the U.S. Supreme Court. NIJC leverages this experience in working with individual clients to advocate for the human rights of non-citizens at all levels and in all branches of government. Also with us today is Bettina Rodriguez Schlegel. She's also an immigration attorney, and she's chief of staff of the Acacia Center for Justice, a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that supports and partners with a national network of human rights defenders who provide legal defense to immigrants at risk of detention and deportation. Bettina began her legal career at linking immigrants to benefits, resources, and education, a project of the Legal Aid Society of San Mateo County. And prior to joining Acacia, Bettina directed the Legal Orientation Program and Immigration Court Help Desk at the Vera Institute of Justice. And we'll hear a little bit more about those programs and the importance of legal counsel in immigration proceedings in just a bit. So here's how we're going to proceed. I've asked each panelist to begin with a short presentation, which should give us a broad framework for understanding the rights of non-citizens and how they're accessed and exercised, and then what we can do to help. The panelists will then take some questions from me, which I've been collecting over the last couple of weeks, and we'll then open up the floor to questions from the audience. We did not ask our panelists to do a comprehensive review of what the new administration has done or plans to do on immigration policy, although I'm sure the panelists are going to mention many specific examples. We just thought it was better to focus on educating and activating us in ways that are applicable regardless of the specific policies that they undertake or announce. And of course, we welcome your questions about specific policies of the new administration, and that's why we've dedicated about half the session today to a Q&A at the end. We're going to start with Mary Meg, and she will explain the rights of non-citizens under current law and in broad strokes. And this framework is particularly important because on the one hand, the US Constitution, the thing that makes it really revolutionary is that it applies to persons, not citizens. But in practice, in legislation, and in jurisprudence, there are lots of constraints that have helped to shape the protections afforded to immigrants and other non-citizens. So the context, the immigration context, is particularly important. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary Mag. So Mary Mag, would you give us a little walkthrough of the rights of immigrants and non-citizens under the law right now?
Yes, thank you, Ev, and thank you all who've joined us and my fellow panelists, Bettina. We've been working together for many years, so it's really an honor to be here and to share with you kind of how cities can defend human rights in the face of mass deportations. And I have to say, the timing of this is really great. I wanted to read from you a quote from the border czar, Tom Homan, who said yesterday, "Sanctuary cities are making it very difficult to arrest the criminals. For instance, Chicago, very well educated. They've been educated on how to defy ICE, how to hide from ICE," Homan said. "They call it know your rights. I call it how to escape arrest." So with that in mind, I want all of you to know who are part of this presentation today that you can make a difference. We have been doing extensive Know Your Rights presentations in the community. This isn't about criminals. This is about hardworking families. This is about our communities. This is about individuals who are raising their children, who are now afraid to take their children to school, afraid to leave their home, afraid to go to work because of what's happening. And we have tried to provide them with the necessary information to know that immigrants, non-citizens have rights, and those rights need to be protected. And I hope all of you will be engaged in that effort to defend immigrants' rights at this very, very critical time in our country's history. So let me talk a little bit about what those rights are for non-citizens. Remember, the Constitution talks about persons, not citizens. So when we're talking about rights, we begin with the Constitution, right? The Fourth Amendment, free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Out of that argument, we are saying right now, you do not have to open your door to your home when someone knocks on your door. They have to have a judicial warrant, a warrant signed by a judge. So what's that mean? You don't open the door, you have them slip that piece of paper under the door or put it on the window, and you make sure that there's a warrant signed by a judge, not by an immigration officer. And if that's not there, you don't have to open that door, and don't open the door. And people have been following those instructions, which has been really critical to keep them from being arrested. At the same time, we filed a lawsuit arguing that under the Fourth Amendment, it is wrong to just indiscriminately, arbitrarily pick up people because of the color of their skin or their accent. So in other words, we saw under the prior Trump administration, ICE officers going to the Home Depot parking lots and arbitrarily just arresting everyone there. They didn't have probable cause whatsoever, and they arrested these individuals. We learned about them as they were calling us for legal representation in their cases. They were in jails, county jails here in the Midwest. Out of our conversations with those clients, we then filed a federal lawsuit in 2018, arguing that that's illegal. You can't just pick someone up for no reason, without probable cause, without a warrant. That resulted in a settlement in which now there's a national policy that all ICE officers have to be trained on the need for a warrant and or documented probable cause. And if that doesn't exist, in Illinois and the 5 surrounding states that compose of the ICE jurisdiction, those individuals should be released from detention. Again, immigrants have rights. They also have rights under the 14th Amendment, and that includes birthright citizenship, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about through one of the executive orders tries to eliminate birthright citizenship. But what I want to talk about, and Bettina will also talk a lot about, is the fact that immigrants have a right to due process. You can't just throw them on a bus, put them on a military plane, and ship them out of the country without giving them a process to make a determination. Are they here without papers? Are they here without grounds for securing legal status? Now, that is a complicated question and a very complicated issue. And the other laws that we have include international laws that under the international law of the Refugee Protocol provides for protection for individuals who are fleeing persecution based on 5 grounds. The Refugee Act of 1980 codified that protocol, that international protocol, and that continues to remain in place. But that's a really important form of relief for many individuals, and especially with the recent arrivals that we've seen in Chicago and other big cities, where people were bused from the border to our cities. Again, there are laws that provide for legal options for individuals, and due process requires that they have that opportunity to have a fair day in court. But what's that mean? They need lawyers, and they need to ask for a lawyer. So if they are stopped in the street, it's very important that they ask, am I under arrest? And if not, calmly walk away. If they are, then they have the right to say, I request you to remain silent. I want to speak to my attorney, and I want to see a judge. That is really important under some of the changes that we have seen with these executive orders and policies. Let me briefly talk about how these rights can be challenged. All right, we all know we have 3 branches of government, right? We have the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. What we saw just in the past 2 days is that pressure makes a difference on the executive branch. We saw this effort to terminate all these grants for cooperative agreements for financial assistance throughout the country, and the outcry by the American public, by leaders in the community to say, this is wrong, this is illegal, the executive branch doesn't have this power, resulted in the court blocking that within a day. But people acted, cities acted, states acted, attorney generals filed lawsuits. Very important. And that interacts with the judicial branch. So the judicial branch was the branch of government that now provides protection for individuals who may be stopped and arrested without probable cause. And now we're going to see what happens with the executive order relating to birthright citizenship in the courts. So the courts are going to be very important. We have to be strategic because we know the Supreme Court is somewhat dangerous right now, and we have to be very thoughtful. So it's important. At NIJC, we are litigating some more cases, and some of those cases involve what we've seen with recent proclamations by this administration. Lastly, the legislative branch. We need to continue to put the pressure on the legislative branch. Legislators need to hear from us. They need to know that what is happening is wrong, is undermining our democracy, and the way we treat immigrants and refugees in this country is not what people want. And for those individuals who are standing up, we need to applaud them. We need to let them know that we are grateful. And cities and states also need to know. Those communities, those policymakers can make a big difference. And of course, community action is another way to really force change and challenge what's happening. And that has an impact on those other 3 branches of government. It's a challenging time. There's no doubt about that. But it's also a really important time for all of us to act and to stand up for immigrant rights. This is a community that is under attack, and this administration wants to divert all the attention on the immigrants so people forget what else is happening that's really harmful. We need to let people know that we care about immigrants, Immigrants have rights, and those rights need to be protected. So I will pass it back to Ev. Happy to answer questions as we continue.
Great. No, thank you very much, Mary Meg. So now that we've got a framework for the rights of immigrants under U.S. law, we'll turn to Bettina to discuss some of the programs through which non-citizens have accessed and exercised these rights, and how the new administration has targeted these programs and made it more difficult for non-citizens to get adequate legal counsel. So Bettina, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ev, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today, and big thanks to Mary Meg for teeing us up so well with that legal overview. My name is Bettina. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. As Ev said, I'm the Chief of Staff for the Acacia Center for Justice. We're a national immigration advocacy nonprofit that's focused on building, strengthening, and expanding immigrant legal defense programs for adults and children across the country. I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to try and share some links in the chat. If I'm not able to, we'll make sure that the links get to you after the webinar. And I hope you'll forgive me that I didn't have the time to make slides, which I think probably would have been helpful, but hopefully you can bear with me talking for a little while. So as Mary Meg mentioned, unlike criminal proceedings where the Sixth Amendment guarantees a defense attorney to those who cannot afford one, there is no right to a publicly funded attorney in immigration court. Finding and securing an immigration attorney can be extremely challenging, either because there are very few attorneys practicing in a given area, the demand for pro bono or low-cost attorneys is so high in a given area, or because they're prohibitively expensive. The stakes for immigration proceedings are very high. I cannot overstate that. And deportation can result in family separation, persecution, or even death in someone's home country. Nevertheless, everyone in the United States, regardless of their immigration status, is entitled to due process protections under the Constitution. Acacia does its work in partnership with a network of over 100 immigrant legal service providers across the country, including the National Immigrant Justice Center, one of our most critical allies, both programmatically and in the policy sphere. There is so much happening right now in the immigration space, devastating changes that are already wreaking havoc on the communities that we serve. Today, I'm going to focus on the impact of one of those challenges, the suspension of several of our most critical programs that protect the due process rights of people facing deportation. And to inject a little hope at the end of the conversation, one of the main collaborative strategies that Acacia is advancing right now to combat the mass deportation agenda of the new administration. I'll try and keep my section brief so that we can leave sufficient time for questions and answers. Okay, so on January 22nd, Acacia received a stop work order from the Department of Justice, telling us to pause 3 legal access programs and a program called the Council for Children's Initiative. And I'm going to go ahead and start dropping some links about what those programs do in the chat. Let me know if that works, and if not, I will give up the links and keep it moving and share the links afterwards. Those programs are called the Legal Orientation Program, also known as LOP, the Immigration Court Help Desk Program, the Family Group Legal Orientation Program, and the Council for Children's Initiative. The orientation programs help children, families, and adults without attorneys to better understand their rights and obligations before immigration court. The LOP does so for adults that are placed in ICE custody, while the ICH and FGLOP do so for adults and families who are living in the community while their cases are winding their way through the immigration court system. Many people served by the ICH and the FGLOP are surveilled by ICE via GPS ankle monitors and smartwatches. The Council for Children's Initiative provides legal representation to children in immigration court proceedings. And the basis for the suspension of those programs was an alleged review for fraud and waste per an executive order entitled Protecting the American People from Invasion. Now, legal access programs support a fair and orderly immigration system by helping children, families, and individuals understand their rights and obligations while they are in immigration court proceedings. These programs serve thousands of individuals annually, with nearly 200,000 served over the last 2 years. These programs have a proven track record of helping children, family, and individuals navigate a notoriously complex immigration system by providing them basic information about their rights and obligations. They have also proven to make the immigration court system more effective, which is currently mired in a 3.5 million case backlog. And programs help those cases move more efficiently because people that understand the process are able to make decisions in their case more quickly than those with no grounding in American immigration laws. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have recognized the critical importance that access to justice programs play in the ability of our immigration courts to function, and for those navigating it to do so effectively and justly and humanely. These programs have been authorized and funded by Congress for the last 2 decades across both Republican and Democratic administrations. If this stop work order is allowed to proceed, hundreds of thousands of immigrants in court proceedings and in detention facilities around the country are going to be left without access to basic legal information. Legal service providers have already reported that ICE facility staff in detention centers are being directed to remove LOP and legal access hotline posters from those facilities. This is a huge concern, particularly as reports break out about the administration ramping up detention facility capacity and executing large-scale raids across the country. As these enforcement actions occur and are carried out by deputized law enforcement agencies without training in immigration law, we can anticipate that many people will be harmed, including long-term U.S. residents, U.S. citizens, which has happened in several cases already, and other vulnerable individuals. People targeted for arrest and detention will be detained without access to legal help or info that would allow them to identify themselves to trained attorneys. We can anticipate huge miscarriages of justice as people are taken to what ultimately amount to black box sites. The current detention system is already failing to provide safe and humane conditions, with overcrowded facilities, inadequate food and medical care, and documented cases of abuse. Detention is frequently applied as punishment, separating families from their children and putting vulnerable groups like LGBT+ individuals at heightened risk. Lawyers' access to clients and people who make pre-scheduled appointments with attorney appear to be continuing right now. And we're hopeful that providers from our programs that have been ordered to stop work can leverage alternate funding to continue to access their clients. But LOP group services, which were one way that we were able to find people and connect them to attorneys in detention, are being curtailed. So the executive order behind this pause undermines not only rights enshrined in our Constitution, but deliberately sows chaos and fear in immigrant communities that have long been the backbone of our nation. We are working on a communications and legislative advocacy strategy, to encourage congressional appropriators to force the administration to rescind these orders so work can continue during any review. That said, every day that these services are suspended, people across the country in detention and those scheduled for immigration court hearings suffer. Basic access to detention centers by advocates is a critical way that we have eyes and ears on what's going on in a system that is cruel and inhumane. I'd also like to point out that we have yet to get any guidance from the government on when or how they plan to conduct a review of these programs. While access has been curtailed at detention sites and court, our network of providers is ready to leverage the knowledge of emergency legal assistance to ensure harm reduction and legal health wherever alternate funding can be allocated to fill the gap. Now, before I turn it back to Ev, I want to inject a little bit of that hope that I mentioned earlier on into the conversation and talk a bit about an exciting collaborative initiative that Acacia is working on with partners like NIJC. It is called the National Immigrant Legal Responders Alliance, or NILRA. NILRA is a partner-driven national initiative designed to protect and resource immigrant communities during this critical time. It brings together 75 organizations, including legal responders, community organizers, and litigators, to create a cohesive national infrastructure that can address urgent legal and humanitarian needs. Immigration enforcement is federally coordinated and requires a national strategy to address local impacts. We are building the plane as we're flying it, but the aim is for local legal responders to rely on NILRA for data tools, trend analysis, and systemic advocacy, while NILRA depends on local organizations for critical on-the-ground information. This collaboration ensures that legal deserts, or places where there are very few immigration attorneys available, and under-resourced regions have access to the tools and supports that they need. NILRA strengthens the ecosystem of immigrant rights organizations by coordinating efforts at all levels. Local organizers will report incidents and provide intake, while national litigators will build systemic cases informed by local data. And this is particularly critical as we observe the ways in which the Trump administration is creating an enforcement and deportation machine without any transparency, eliminating access to people in detention, terminating legal protections, and arresting people all over the country in raids designed to terrify the community. NILRA is raising $10 million in the first 100 days to support rapid response efforts and scale up national coordination. The vast majority of this funding will go to frontline partners. We're currently conducting outreach to cities and states for investment. If you're at all interested in supporting this work in your locality, please let me know, and I will share the NILRA proposal for your review, as well as put you in touch with our development team. The funds aim to be used for providing direct funding to frontline legal responders so they can provide representation, advice, and counsel to people that are picked up in raids, support local and regional partners to operationalize the rapid response infrastructure, and the development of tools, trainings, and systems to ensure long-term sustainability. I know I've talked for a while. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your time and attention. It's an honor to be here with you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Bettina. And I think, for those of you, keep educating yourself on this. I think the more you read, for those who aren't familiar with the immigration system, things that, like in the criminal system, court-appointed counsel, you have to remember that that's not there. And LOP and things like that were the kind of closest, facsimile of that. And even those are gone in. And so, there are bright spots too. There are cities that have allowed their public defenders to represent people in immigration proceedings, people facing deportation. I've worked with the public defender's office in San Francisco on this. It's true in Brooklyn. And they're in states like Illinois have done some of this, where there's some public money because people recognize that, states and localities have recognized that they have so much at stake because these are their residents, these are their taxpayers and their families. So, but those are all anecdotal. There isn't a national system for that. And I think for those of you who haven't been to immigration court, it's really something. It's just different than what your expectations of a courtroom and of justice would be. And that's not to say that it's always in bad faith. I'm not saying all the lawyers and judges are wrong. It just, when you have a system that's designed to be adversarial and there isn't anyone representing one of the sides, it's inevitably the power dynamic becomes really asymmetrical. I mean, just imagine a trial where you have, the prosecutor and the judge in one room, and it looks sort of like a courtroom, but the person who's effectively on trial is in a closet at a detention center in a jumpsuit on a camera and doesn't know when they're supposed to speak or not speak. That's how a lot of these go down. And it doesn't meet our normal expectations for justice. And again, I'm not bad mouthing the judges or lawyers of the system. I'm just saying that that's the starting point. So the bar is already pretty low, and removing know your rights and legal protections in a system that already looks like that is really something else. So that's just something I want you all to consider. So what I'd like to do now that we've talked a bit about legal rights and access to counsel, I'd like to turn to some basic advice for those of us who are not attorneys and who don't normally work on immigration, but would really like to help and defend the rights of our neighbors, our friends, our clients, and people who are vulnerable to mass deportation in our communities. And NIJC has prepared this really useful guide, I think, on their website. And I'm going to share the link here in the chat so that everybody can see it. And then I'm going to ask Mary Meg if she would kind of walk us through the 5 points here. I'm sorry, I'm just cutting and pasting. I'm going to put it right here in the Q&A, and I'll put it in the chat as well. And I'll ask Peter, I'm putting this in the chat for the hosts and panelists, if you would also just kick this out to everybody. I just put it in answer to one of the questions as well. Okay, so I'm just going to put it in here in a couple of places. So let me turn it over to Mary Meg and ask if she would kind of walk us through these 5 recommendations that NIJC has made, again, to non-lawyers for how we might respond to mass deportation in our communities.
Well, following up on what Bettina was saying, I think access to legal counsel is absolutely critical, but it's very challenging to secure that. we get almost 500 calls a day. And obviously we can't manage that. We have, as Ev said, we have outstanding pro bono attorneys that we train and support in their representation of individuals, but legal counsel is absolutely critical. So I think for people, the 5 points I would start with is seek legal consultation. If you know an immigrant, if you know of someone who is struggling with their legal status, please try to connect them with a lawyer. It's really critical. And the American Immigration Lawyers Association has referrals. That number is 1-800-954-0254. If the individual is in the Midwest, you can see our website, immigrantjustice.org, that will provide information for how to secure a consultation. And again, for NIJC, the National Immigrant Justice Center, it's low-income individuals only. But we can refer people to private attorneys, of which there are some excellent immigration attorneys. But the last thing you want is for someone to get deported who had legal options without exercising those rights to secure that legal status. And that's really important as we enter this time where certain temporary statuses are ending pursuant to this executive order, and we need to make sure those individuals get legal counsel to determine, are they eligible for something else? The other resource for a nonprofit organization is the Immigration Advocates Network or Illinois Access to Justice. And those information will provide you with names of lawyers as well as accredited representatives who have been approved by the Department of Justice working for a nonprofit organization such as NIJC that could provide some type of legal consultation or representation. The second area I want to emphasize is creating a safety plan. Again, people need to be proactive and be able to respond and make sure their family is safe if there is some type of immigration emergency. ICE officers are roaming the streets, unfortunately, and creating fear, but also people need to be prepared. So a safety plan would identify your emergency contact, memorize that phone number, and let that person know who's your emergency contact, that you will be contacting them if they are arrested. Provide your children's school or daycare with an emergency contact to pick up your child. And again, make sure the emergency contact person is aware that they will be contacted should something happen to care for your children. Provide authorization in writing for your emergency contact to make medical and legal decisions for your child. I don't think, at least in the state of Illinois, that you need a guardianship. In fact, guardianships could be somewhat dangerous. So I think it's better just to have things in writing and have that in a safe place. A safe place that others know where it is, and make it clearly explain that this is in case of an ICE arrest. Tell your loved ones, if you are detained, that they can locate you using the ICE's online locator. And that is https://odls/number/search. We'll put that on the chat too, or the link. But oftentimes people are arrested in Chicago and they're detained in Wisconsin or in Kentucky or in Indiana. And you may not be able to locate them right away, but that is a way to be able to locate people where they are. And then you can contact them at that county jail. 3, collect your documents in a safe place. One of the recent developments with this administration is that they have expanded what's called expedited removal, where someone who has not been in the country for someone who's been in the country for less than 2 years, anywhere in the country, can be rapidly deported unless they can prove that they've been here more than 2 years. So it is absolutely critical that now, when an individual is living in our communities, that they collect their documents to prove that they've resided in this country for more than 2 years. Identity information and financial information should be placed in a safe place along with these documents. And that could be school records, it could be income tax returns, utility bills, medical records, any type of document that shows that you've been here since 2020, whatever the year is. Or, for many of our clients, it's been, 1990. So those documents are really important, and make sure your emergency contact knows where those documents are and can access them. Our website has really good guidance on this, and we're continuing to update it depending on what we're seeing in the community. Avoid immigration fraud. Again, these are tips for you to share with individuals in your community. We are seeing a lot of people being taken advantage of, being defrauded by people who are exploiting them, saying, we can complete this work authorization form. We can get you legal status. We can get you that green card. Well, absolutely, that would be wonderful to have in this environment. But the reality is people are not all eligible for this. And if they do apply for these different benefits and they're not eligible, they're going to be immediately placed in deportation proceedings and deported. So it's really important that people get good advice, not from notarios, not from some, store in the corner that sells health food or something, but that people get accredited representatives or lawyers who they are assured of know the law. Never sign any application with false information. Never sign a blank form. Ask for copies of everything you sign. And if the advice sounds too good to be true, get a second opinion. Filing an immigration application for which you're not eligible is devastating. It's not like a divorce where you can go back and fix it, right? It's over. So people really, really need to know, make sure that they are getting qualified legal advice. Finally, 5, be alert for scams. We are seeing a lot of digital scams, social media. As ICE officer, please call me right away. I have some information about so-and-so or about you to help you, navigate this difficult time. The US government doesn't use social media. It doesn't even use phones. So it's really, really important that people don't get exploited, don't get caught up in these scams. And if there is a question or doubt, consult an attorney or accredited representative. And most importantly, avoid sharing information on social media. Immigration can look at your phone if you are arrested. And that is going to be really important for people to protect that. People coming in at the airports have been turned back because of information on their phones that indicate that they may be working and they don't have a work visa. So do not share that information on your phones. So that's it in a nutshell. I know the 5 points are somewhat overwhelming, but I think all of them make logical sense. Consult an attorney, have a safety plan, avoid fraud. Don't, be a victim of digital scams, and collect your documents. So thank you.
No, thanks so much, Mary Meg. That's all good. And what I would hope you guys would do in the audience is, if you think about this advice, if you think about where it comes from, just think about the practices. I mean, why do we want people to have an emergency plan for the kids? Well, because there's a history of enforcement actions and raids and stuff where they make no provision for the children of people who are arrested and detained, and the kids come home from school and there's nobody there, and they end up in in state custody. Their local county Department of Children and Family Services takes custody of the kids. So stuff that people don't want to happen. Same with all the prohibitions on fraud. The thing about false statements, it's not even about saying, oh, don't commit fraud or don't lie, but it's just something to understand is, when you go to immigration court, or if you start looking at a lot of the decisions that are made on whether it's at the border or in immigration court, the most common thing that catches up with somebody that that throws a wrinkle in an otherwise very good claim for relief, allowing someone to stay in the United States, is a contradiction in what they said to one official versus what they said to another. And there might be 10 years between them. And the first conversation might have been, with an agent at the border 10 years ago where they had no idea that it was even being recorded or written down. But still, any contradiction or anything that could be possibly conceived of as a making a false statement can and will be used against them. So that's a very, very important thing. And the same with the fraud. The reason we have the warnings about the fraud is because, unfortunately, and this isn't new, this is something that's been going on for a long time, the immigration fraud is really rampant. So I would like to ask a couple of questions that I've gotten from some people who I think are in this audience over the last couple of weeks. But I would like you to invite the audience too. If you have some questions, please put them in the Q&A. We may not be able to address all of them right on the spot here, but I'll try to do my job as moderator and curate them a little bit and ask the panelists to respond. So think about it, develop some questions, and please put them in the Q&A. And in the meantime, I would like to ask a couple of common questions of the moderator. So this one came from a colleague just the other day, and I've heard versions of it over the last couple of months from lots of different people. And it's more of the scenario than a question. And the scenario is this: if ICE agents arrive at the school where I teach or the university where I teach, do I have to let them into my office or my classroom or the dorm I supervise, etc.? Most institutions have some kind of policy preventing law enforcement from entering without a judicial warrant. But since immigration is a civil, not a criminal matter, are they likely to have a warrant? Does ICE show up with warrants? How do warrants work in immigration enforcement? And I wonder if you guys could tackle a little bit of that and maybe give some examples of some of what you've seen.
Well, I would begin by saying you should check with your university regarding the policy. Here in Chicago, the Chicago Public School Systems have sent out a memo to all the schools, to the teachers, to the parents, to the administrators, explaining what to do if an ICE agent shows up. And we had that happen last week. Well, what people thought was an ICE agent. It turns out it was the Secret Service going to elementary school. The whole situation was very strange, but nonetheless, the receptionist, the principal, whoever answered the door when they came as officers, ICE officers or Secret Service, whatever they were, they said, we can't talk to you. We can't let you in until we contact headquarters. And that's what they did. And then the headquarters intervened. So again, academic institutions, schools, those are places with a mission, and they're not open spaces for anyone to come in. They have to have a policy, I would argue, as to how to handle that. And, even in our own office, if someone comes to the front door saying, I need to talk to so-and-so, and they're obviously an enforcement officer, we don't just let them in. We have to have a process and a policy, and then usually we'll call our general counsel.
Yeah, Bettina, do you have anything to add about that in your experience with the kind of warrants or paper that ICE will present?
Yeah, I agree with everything Mary Meg said. I think folks on the webinar may be aware that the administration recently rescinded a policy called the Sensitive Locations Memo, which sort of directed ICE officers and other DHS agents from going to schools and churches and hospitals. That policy is now off the books. So I think it's extremely important for school districts and individual schools to have a policy in place, a safety protocol. Certainly one thing to always look out for is that judicial warrant, which ICE officers can carry. It may list the name of one person. It may list the name of a business or like a building at large, but either way, whoever is interfacing with those officers should be checking to make sure they have paperwork. And if they don't, I think that's the end of the conversation right there. But certainly always important to check the documentation that they have with them.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So we're getting some good questions from the audience. I'm just going to wait. Anybody else wants to post them? Post a couple more, and then we'll put them together. There are a couple of that are similar, and I will ask them live here of our panelists. Let me ask. I want to ask you. There's two more questions that kind of jive with some of what the audience is asking. I think one thing that people don't understand about the immigration system is how much discretion there is already within the system. And I think that's a really important bit of context because, people can rightfully say, well, wait, how can this new administration, do all this stuff, make all these changes? There's no change in the law. And in some ways, they're probably just overreaching. And the answer is, well, they can't, and we have to contest it. But in other ways, I think it's because there is already so much discretion in the system. So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about, what you anticipate with regard to things like prosecutorial discretion or which individuals, might get paroled into the United States or people who were brought in under discretionary measures who are now vulnerable to those measures being rescinded and then that welcome just being completely rescinded. Bettina, maybe you could start on that one.
Sure. There has been so much happening in the last couple of days, and some of the things that we're seeing include the rescission of some of those discretionary or otherwise more gosh, I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, but we're certainly seeing a lot of changes in that arena. So what we've heard through the grapevine from partners is that prosecutorial discretion inboxes at government attorney offices. So within immigration court, the players are the immigration judge, who's an administrative law judge, and then the attorney for ICE, or they're called the OPLA attorney. And those OPLA attorneys during the Biden administration usually had email inboxes that were devoted to prosecutorial discretion requests and related documentation. What we've heard from some providers that we work with in the field is that those inboxes no longer exist. They're closed. They're no longer accepting emails. And so that's one indication, I think, of what we're seeing. And we're also seeing quite a few statuses under threat. The parole program that existed for Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, for instance. The temporary protected status for Venezuelans was rescinded today. I mean, it's all happening at such a breakneck pace that I think for many of us, like, we're just struggling to keep up with the influx of news. It's like drinking from a fire hose
Yes.
right now. But those are just some examples. So I think that's all in question, right? Like, there's great risk right now to anyone that is here in any kind of potentially precarious status.
Yeah, and I hope people, and in some ways it creates all these different categories of vulnerability that weren't as visible, because like for example, you think back in the Obama administration, there were lots of immigration judges who allowed people who claimed sexual orientation-based persecution to stay in the country. Now, they didn't always give them, I'm not saying they granted them all asylum, they didn't, but by doing things in a discretionary manner, they got to stay, but they got to stay without having a status. And now you have these groups that the government knows are here because they allowed them to be, and they can identify them, and they know where they are. And that kind of, so that there things like that, I think educating yourself on, on who's most vulnerable, because I think that lots of people know about temporary protected status. I think that, the current president has, made a lot of noise about it, but there are lots of other groups that are actually in really precarious situations. I think we all know a little bit about the Dreamers. We know something about temporary protected status, but there are all kinds of other groups who are here thanks to discretionary measures. And in some cases with temporary protected status, you have people who came 25 years ago who still have temporary protected status, but they have no other immigration status. It's just been renewed over and over again. And now they've been here to the point that they have children who are citizens and they're well integrated in their communities, and it would be really, really disruptive to think about any kind of removal. So that's another one. So here's a question from the audience, a more specific question, but I think it's a good one because we haven't talked about how visas and other kinds of statuses are involved here. So one attendee asks, I work with writers, artists, and scholars who are typically here on J1 visas. Many are living in exile due to persecution of their work in their home countries. A few of them have international cases with Human Rights Watch due to the persecution they faced, and a few of them have approached me in fear that government officials from their home country could contact the US government demanding their return. Are you able to speak to this kind of situation or possibility? Mary Maggie, you want to take that on?
Hard one to answer because who knows what's going to happen with this administration. I mean, their information's in the federal database, right?
Yeah.
I think, what would be important is for those individuals, if they want to remain in the country, to apply for asylum and ask for it to be sealed, to protect that and the information in there. But yeah, I think that's a fear that is a reasonable one. Like even before we had this Trump administration, we've had clients who have been afraid to be public about their human rights case in their home country because they're afraid that the people who were persecuting them will learn about it and come back and get them. So I think it's a reasonable fear. And I think it's really important to take all the necessary steps to protect them. I think it's important, again, going back to the idea of a safety plan, that there's a community of people who are aware and will be available to protect them should something happen. But it's a scary time.
Yeah, and I would just say too, just like Mary Meg and Bettina have both stressed, right? They should speak to a lawyer because, like for example, they've been here less than a year, and their fear of persecution is something they can document really well. They may be eligible to apply for asylum, or if they end up in some kind of proceedings and they have a case that they'd be persecuted in their home country, that maybe the torture convention. A protection of the torture convention is an option. There are all kinds of very specific things that one needs to do to qualify for those, and the only way to figure that out is to speak with an attorney, and not in general terms, but like an individual speaking about the facts of their particular case. But that's a good question, and thank you for sending it. This is another one that's come up in some of the questions that I've gotten in my inbox about this, and that's about allies, about people who are trying to help people. And someone here in the chat says, if you engage on behalf of someone who's vulnerable or hide someone, are the consequences that you might face as an ally? And what if you're a public employee? Bettina, would you like to take a first stab at that one?
A really tough question. And I'll be honest, I don't have a grounding necessarily in like the applicable laws here. So I don't want to like sow fear and chaos, right? By like saying things that may not be true. I do think that there is a lot of concern, and this is not directly addressing the question, but it's on a parallel course. I think there's a lot of concern among organizations and community groups that serve immigrants about being targeted themselves. And there's quite a lot of concern about what the administration may do. So those fears are not unfounded. Those are completely valid concerns. I don't know, Mary Meg, if you know more about sort of like the applicable laws as they relate to individuals. But yeah, I don't want to cause more confusion by saying something I don't quite understand.
Yeah, I kind of like the same boat as Bettina here. They're in the, was it late 70s, early 80s, there was a whole sanctuary movement that provided protection for immigrants, refugees, primarily from Central America. And, there have been efforts to prosecute some of those individuals. But, we are such a integrated community right now with immigrants. I mean, immigrants are individuals that we work with, we go to school with. It just may be very natural for us to provide housing or shelter to someone who's unhoused all of a sudden, or something happens in their life. Oftentimes, you may not even know that they're an immigrant or undocumented. And it's just someone that you interact with every day. And then lo and behold, they're fearful, and you learn something about them. So I think, some of this is just going to be just natural caring for each other. And I feel like that's what this administration is trying to break down, and sow distrust. And we are a community of people who care for each other, no matter what the circumstances are. And I would hate to be fearful. I know people are concerned about protecting their organizations, as Bettina said. There's a lot of concern about, what happens if I do this? Or, I've gotten many calls from religious organizations and private schools saying, we want to help our undocumented population or the community that we serve, our congregation or constituents, or, even from daycare centers. And I just think we can't let this fear overtake us from being caring individuals, because that's what makes this country so great. And we've seen that over and over in history. And so now's the time to have that historical moment of care for our brothers and sisters.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, there's good news and bad news. I think that if you look at, there have been attempts in almost every presidential administration in the last 25 years, there's someone who tries to prosecute someone for providing humanitarian assistance. It's happened on the US border, probably 5 times in the last 25 years. That's the bad news. There are things on the statute that can be used. There's a harboring thing in the INA. But they mostly failed. And, it doesn't mean that's not a predictor of what would happen in the future. Even the sanctuary cases, which, led to convictions and stuff in the 1980s, most of the actual sentences were suspended. So it's not, there's always been a more theater than, real repression from those efforts. But that's not to say that they're not costly and that they don't, that they're not effective at sowing fear. So I think, we don't know. We don't know if that kind of enforcement is going to change, if the present administration will try to really push those boundaries. But it's something you can read more about, and you'd have to make a risk assessment, based on very specific actions in a particular context. I want to get at, since just, as to take one kind of another question here that's really related to the cities thing. There's a great question here. Are there any alternative actions that county and city officials could take besides requesting the assistance of a public defender to represent clients in immigration court? I think that's a great one. And let me turn that to Mary Meg. You've had NIJC's had a good relationship, I would say, with the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. Sometimes contentious, but could you speak a little bit to that question about other things cities could do?
Start with having an office of immigrant and refugees. Like our mayor, first thing he did is created a deputy position, deputy of migrants and refugees. So this woman, B. Ponce de Leon, is just fabulous and is a go-to person for the community and for the different city services to make sure that people feel safe accessing those services. And that's really important, that there's a point person in City Hall available for the community. The next thing is, we worked really hard to maintain this welcoming city ordinance. This was an ordinance that was passed, 40 years ago now, by our former mayor Harold Washington, to protect immigrants and to prohibit city officials, including law enforcement, from cooperating with the federal ICE enforcement officers. And the reason for this was to make our city safer, so that women men, victims of violence, domestic violence, whatever was gang violence, whatever was going on, they felt comfortable going to the police and reporting it, as opposed to fearing that they were going to be turned into ice. So it really was a very important piece of legislation to get passed. Now, there are threats on that. And well, I should say we've improved it over the years. And right now there are some threats. But overall, those individuals who are threatening to undermine that piece of legislation in the city are really being drowned out because people believe, again, what I said, the immigrants are in our community. I mean, and most of our cities, if you look at them carefully, there's a history of immigration, of immigrants building that city, that community. Right. It's important to pull that out and recognize that. And the same at the state level. It's been really important that we educate members of the General Assembly, of the governor's office about why it's important to protect our immigrant neighbors. And again, we're seeing some of the opposite. Unfortunately, we saw something in Indiana of the governor there. But the more we can speak out and say, look, our community is made up of mixed status people. That means family members who are documented and those who are undocumented. Breaking up this family is only going to harm our communities and our tax base, our Social Security, whatever it is. Our communities are stronger because of immigrants. And I think that's a really important message to deliver to your mayor, to your county commissioners, to your governor, to your, state legislators, that people care about immigrants in our community. And let's see what kind of laws we can pass to protect them. Our immigrants in our community are safer than they would be without the Welcoming City Ordinance here in Chicago and without the Illinois Trust Act.
No, thank you. And just just to double up on that, I mean, if you think about how a lot of immigration enforcement starts, it starts with the, traffic stop or an encounter with an institution. So you need your whole city is safer if people call the fire department when there's a fire or an emergency and they're confident that the first responder is there because of that, not there because of to check anybody's status. And the same thing with calling the police within the neighborhood for crime and things like that. So working at a very practical level and thinking about like how do people encounter the government and how can they do so with confidence that they're doing it for the reason that they should be doing it, not avoiding these practices out of fear. Let's take, there's a good question that's been here for a while, and it's one, those of us who are on campuses, I remember 4 years ago, I sat on a university committee on this, and it's always a difficult question. But since we have you guys here, I want to hear what you have to say. And that's any suggestions for reassuring our undocumented students in high schools and colleges and on our campuses if we teach. Our campus protects student privacy and refers ICE officers to the president's office. And I think that's what should the message be? And what role do we play as a teacher or a mentor or somebody where we have some rights and responsibilities with regard to the people in a classroom, but we're also not in law enforcement and we're not attorneys. Bettina, would you have some, what would your guidance be there?
I think one of the best things that we can do is share reliable, clear, accessible information about people's rights. And fortunately, there are a lot of great examples out in the community already. I would say that NIJC's resources available on their website, which are available in a number of languages, are a fantastic place to start. And so I think really it's about sharing knowledge, voicing your support, letting folks know that you're there for them. You hear their concerns, you can appreciate their anxiety. That's very real and very valid, and making sure that they just have the information at their disposal. I think that's really the best thing that we can do right now, is just share the knowledge and disseminate it as far and wide as we can.
Yeah, and I think that's great, and I think for check your university, check and see what they've done too. For example, And can be surprised too at which institutions will develop best practice. I mean, I was at a very conservative Catholic university for 7 years, and under the last Trump administration in particular, and we convinced the administration to copy the University of California in the way we did the financial aid forms, so that we didn't have to ask anybody's citizenship. And then, therefore, we could tell students that all the materials they submit when they apply and enroll in our university don't make us a sort of first reporter of the fact that they don't have citizenship. And it's a very basic thing, but that helped really create confidence, I think, among the students. I also think just like community measures, anything that you can do to show that there's a community of people that understand their precarity, and that they're worried about this, and it makes it hard to be a student. Actually, think of it from your own sphere. That's really helpful too. I think that was one of the lessons of the first Trump administration. Um,
And I also
yeah,
add,
go ahead, Mary Meg.
is the importance of encouraging your students to get legal consultations to see
Yeah.
if they have any other option other than an F1. I've heard, unfortunately, a number of students who are graduating and already had job offers, and those were rescinded. So it's really important that they look at what are their other options and get support in that, even in career services.
No, that's really good. That's really good advice. Let me ask you a question. We've been talking a lot about some of the difficult stuff and the stuff that's hard to answer. But we'll take just a few minutes more. I want to end with something that gives us some hope. And I want to ask you. I want to kind of remind everybody that the last time around, with the same person as president, the federal courts blocked or unwound maybe 90% of what the administration tried to do with executive orders and other discretionary immigration enforcement policies and procedures. And that it's important that I'm not just talking about the quote unquote Muslim ban. I mean, this was sort of down the line. And I want to ask you guys, do you think it's likely that something similar will happen this time around? And where do you think they're most likely to be blocked? And what are the biggest challenges, the things where they might succeed and we might have to respond in a different way? Maybe both of you could weigh in on this. Maybe Bettina, you want to go first, and then we can go to Mary Meg.
I see Mary Meg came off mute, so I'm going to allow her to go first.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry.
I don't care. I was just going to say, this administration, I think, is much more prepared than the first round. And so we're seeing these executive orders a little more airtight, but really they know the system and they know the weaknesses, and they're going after them. And that's really, really frightening. And even losing or firing civil servants is very concerning. And we've seen that in the immigration court. And there'll be some lawsuits, but there's going to be a lot of harm while those lawsuits are pending or moving very slowly, I imagine. I think where the executive orders that are most vulnerable is the birthright citizenship. I mean, the ACLU immediately filed that lawsuit. And I think that one has a lot of momentum in terms of the illegality of that executive order. And hopefully we're going to prevail all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that will be kind of a model for what could come next. An area where there is absolutely no viable challenge is, say, refugee admissions. I mean, that is completely within the executive branch. It's a presidential proclamation. Whether refugees come in or don't come in, they have that power, and he's absolutely exercising that power. But I think there's areas of pressure. And again, as I said in the beginning, we saw the president rescind this thing of, terminating all these federal grants. So that's really hopeful, because there was a lawsuit, there was outrage, there was pressure on members of Congress, there was pressure in the community, business community, religious communities, everybody was impacted by this. And I just think the more pressure we're putting on this administration, members of Congress. More likely we will see some of these executive orders either be rescinded or dwindled or not be implemented.
Very good. Bettina, do you want to wait on this too?
I echo everything that Mary Meg said and the analysis that she presented. And I think what I'll just offer is that as much as we know the incoming Trump administration was preparing to move very quickly on immigration, I mean, Project 2025 proved to be the playbook, and they have just boom, 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 hit everything on that list within the first 8 days of their administration. I don't even know where we are at this point, but the immigrant rights field was doing the same. Obviously, we couldn't anticipate exactly how things were going to play out, but people were gathering, they were talking, litigators, policy-based organizations, faith-based groups were convening and organizing. And so that's why I think you're seeing the speed of the responsive lawsuits, the organization in terms of messaging and advocacy. One thing that I think the field learned from the last go round was that fracturing within our movement slows us down, it weakens us. And if we are like united, consistent, and really speaking from the same or singing from the same songbook, we'll be more effective. And so I think we're starting to see that here in this new administration, and I hope to see it continue. I think the biggest risk is burnout, and just folks getting really overextended as we try and put out multiple fires at the same time.
Well, that's great, and I really appreciate that, and on the theme of burnout too, I really appreciate the time from both of you. I promised Mary Meg I would get out of here, but a quarter after the hour, so I want to honor that. I know we don't have a big crowd here to give you a giant, a giant round of applause, but in your homes, in your hearts, please. Please thank Mary Meg and Bettina for doing this. If you can support their organizations, please do so. We've shared a bunch of links. We'll also make sure we send out an email to everybody who registered for this event to follow up with the names of a couple of yes for names of organizations again and links. I think we can easily handle that. So keep track of their work. Again, it's the Acacia Center for Justice and the National Immigrant Justice Center. You can also reach out to me through the Young Initiative very easily. Thanks to our friends at Occidental College and the Young Initiative for putting together the webinar. We do a whole series of these. Students do an awesome job in helping us to coordinate and get the work out. So thank you all for doing that. Thanks to my colleagues on the steering committee for the Human Rights Cities Alliance for pushing this issue front and center. I don't think we've ever done anything with immigration before, or the group hadn't. And so this was really great. We made it the first one of the year, and I really thank everybody for coming. I don't think we've ever had for one of these webinars a crowd this big, and it speaks to the interest and concern, but also your solidarity with our communities and desire to do some good. So take those 5 points, turn them into action items, get involved, and we'll see you all very soon. So thank you very much for coming, everyone.